The gunshot echoed across the prairie as Kieran Quinn spurred his horse harder, the taste of dust and desperation thick in his mouth. A plume of black smoke rose against the horizon, not the controlled burn of a campfire, but the violent, hungry blaze of destruction. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Kieran was a man who'd seen his share of hardship, his 30 years etched in the weathered lines of his sun-browned face and the cautious way he surveyed the vast Montana territory. Spring of 1877 had brought an unusually dry spell, making the grasslands brittle as old parchment. As his horse crested the ridge, his heart hammered against his ribs. Below lay the charred skeleton of what had once been a homestead, flames still licking at the blackened timbers. "Whoa," he called, drawing his horse to a halt. Dismounting in one fluid motion, his hand instinctively reached for his Colt revolver. 6 years riding with the Montana Rangers had taught him caution, though his service had ended 2 seasons past. Now he ran cattle on his own modest spread 10 miles east, but old habits died hard. The acrid smell of smoke stung his nostrils as he approached, hat pulled low against the heat still radiating from the ruins. That's when he saw her, a crumpled form at the edge of what had been a garden patch. The woman lay face down, her dress charred and torn, angry red burns visible on her exposed skin. "Madam," Kieran called, approaching cautiously. When she didn't respond, he knelt beside her, gently turning her over. Her face was smudged with ash, a nasty burn running from her left temple down her neck, disappearing beneath what remained of her collar. But she was breathing shallow, ragged breaths that wheezed painfully from her lungs. Her eyelids fluttered at his touch, revealing pain-clouded hazel eyes that struggled to focus on his face. "Water," she whispered, the word barely audible. Kieran nodded, retrieving his canteen. With one arm supporting her shoulders, he held the canteen to her cracked lips. "Easy now." "Just a little." She managed a few sips before falling back against his arm, a whimper escaping her as the movement aggravated her burns. "Can you tell me your name, madam?" he asked, scanning the area for any signs of who might have done this or if they might still be nearby. "Clara," she managed, her voice rough from smoke. "Clara Kincaid. Miss Kincaid, I'm Kieran Quinn. I'm going to get you to a doctor." He hesitated, not wanting to cause her more pain but knowing she couldn't stay here. "Can you tell me what happened?" Her eyes widened, suddenly frantic. "My brother, Timothy, they took him." "Who took him, Miss Kincaid?" "Men, 3 of them, said he owed a debt." Her words came between labored breaths. "I tried to stop them. They burned everything." Kieran's jaw tightened. Debt collectors turning to violence wasn't unheard of in these parts, but this level of brutality spoke of something else entirely. "The nearest doctor is in Copperhill, about 8 miles southwest," Kieran told her. "I need to move you, Miss Kincaid. It's going to hurt, but I can't leave you here." She nodded weakly, bracing herself. As gently as possible, Kieran gathered her in his arms. Despite his care, she cried out, the sound cutting through him like a knife. Once on his feet, he cradled her against his chest, her head resting against his shoulder. "I've got you," he said softly, carrying her to his horse. Getting her mounted would be a challenge, but he had no choice. "I'm going to help you up, then climb on behind you." It took several agonizing minutes, but finally they were situated, Clara leaning back against Kieran's chest, his arms around her to hold the reins. He could feel the heat radiating from her burned skin and the occasional tremor that ran through her body. "Hold on, Miss Kincaid," he murmured, guiding his horse into a careful walk. "Doc Sullivan's the best in 3 counties. He'll fix you right up." As they rode, Kieran kept his eyes alert for any sign of the men who had attacked the Kincaid place. The sparse settlements in this part of the territory made law enforcement stretched thin, which emboldened those who operated outside it. If Clara's brother had fallen in with the wrong sort, there was a chance the men responsible were still in the area. "You know the men who did this?" he asked, trying to keep her conscious. One called another. "Vance," she managed, her voice fading, "said they'd come back for me if Timothy didn't pay." "You're safe now," Kieran assured her, though he wasn't certain it was true. "I won't let them near you again." Clara made a sound that might have been acknowledgement before her head lolled against his chest. Alarmed, Kieran pressed his fingers to her neck, relieved to find a pulse rapid but present. Stay with me, Miss Kincaid, he urged, nudging his horse into a slightly faster pace, balancing the need for speed against the jarring that would worsen her injuries. The sun was beginning its westward descent when they finally reached the outskirts of Copperhill. The town wasn't much a main street with the essential businesses, a church, and scattered homes, but it had a doctor, and that was all that mattered now. Kieran rode straight to Doc Sullivan's office, a white clapboard building with a small sign identifying it as a medical practice. With Clara unconscious in his arms, he called out as he approached, "Doc Sullivan, need help out here." The door opened almost immediately, revealing a man in his 50s with steel gray hair and a neatly trimmed beard. Doctor. James Sullivan took one look at the woman in Kieran's arms and stepped aside. "Bring her in," he ordered, already moving to prepare his examination table. Kieran carried Clara inside, laying her gently on the table Sullivan had cleared. "Found her at a burned-out homestead east of here. She's badly burned, and she was conscious earlier but passed out during the ride." Sullivan nodded, already examining Clara with practiced efficiency. "You did right to bring her in. These burns are serious." He glanced up at Kieran. "You know her?" "No, name's Clara Kincaid. Said men burned her place, took her brother over some debt." The doctor's hands paused momentarily. "Kincaid must be Andrew Kincaid's children. He died last winter pneumonia. They've been trying to keep that homestead going alone." Kieran watched as Sullivan began cutting away the charred remains of Clara's dress where it adhered to her burns. "Will she make it, Doc?" "Can't say for certain yet. Burns are tricky business, infections the real danger." He glanced up at Kieran. "I need to clean these wounds and treat her. Might be best if you wait outside." Kieran hesitated, strangely reluctant to leave. "I'll be right outside if you need anything," he finally said, backing toward the door. Once outside, Kieran leaned against the porch railing, removing his hat to run a hand through his dark hair. He should be heading back to his own ranch. He had responsibilities, cattle that needed tending. But something about Clara Kincaid's situation pulled at him. Perhaps it was the memory of his own parents' homestead burning when he was just 12, raiders killing his father while he and his mother escaped into the night. Or maybe it was simply that he couldn't abide men who preyed on those weaker than themselves. An hour passed before Doctor Sullivan opened the door, wiping his hands on a towel. His expression was grave but not defeated. "She's stable for now," he reported. "Burns on about 20% of her body, left side mainly, and her back. She must have been trying to get away when whatever happened occurred." "Will she recover?" Kieran asked, straightening. "If infection doesn't set in, she has a good chance. I've cleaned the burns and applied salve, but she'll need careful tending for weeks to come." The doctor gave Kieran an appraising look. "She mentioned you when she came around, briefly called you her rescuer." Kieran shook his head. "Just happened to be riding by and saw the smoke." "Well, she's asking for you now. She's conscious but weak. Try not to agitate her." Nodding, Kieran replaced his hat and followed the doctor inside. Clara lay on the table, now dressed in a loose cotton gown, bandages visible at her neck and arm. Her face had been cleaned of ash, revealing delicate features beneath the angry red burn on her left temple. Despite her injuries, he could see she was a beautiful woman, probably in her early 20s. Her eyes opened as he approached, recognition flooding her face. "Mr. Quinn," she whispered. "Miss Kincaid," he replied, removing his hat. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been cooked half through," she said, attempting a weak smile that quickly faltered. "Thank you for bringing me here." "No need for thanks. Anyone would have done the same." Her eyes held his, unexpectedly direct despite her condition. "No, they wouldn't have. Most would have left me to die rather than burden themselves." Kieran didn't know how to respond to that. She wasn't wrong. The frontier bred a certain hardness in people, a focus on survival that sometimes came at the expense of compassion. "Your brother," he said instead. "Any idea where those men might have taken him?" Clara's eyes filled with tears. "No, Timothy. He's been gambling. I told him no good would come of it, but after Pa died." She trailed off, wincing as she tried to shift position. "Easy," Kieran said. "You need to rest. We can talk about this later." "No," she insisted, reaching out to grasp his wrist with surprising strength. "Please, Mr. Quinn. Timothy is all I have left. They said if he didn't pay by the end of the week, they'd kill him. That's only 3 days from now." Kieran hesitated. He wasn't a lawman anymore, hadn't been for 2 years. Getting involved in this would likely mean trouble, possibly deadly trouble. But the desperation in Clara's eyes stirred something in him he thought he'd buried long ago. "I'll make some inquiries," he finally said. "See if anyone knows anything about these men, but I can't promise anything, Miss Kincaid." Relief washed over her face. "Thank you." "Timothy's not a bad man, just lost since Pa died." Dr. Sullivan returned, carrying a small bottle. "That's enough talking for now. Miss Kincaid needs rest." He measured a dose of liquid into a small glass. "This will help with the pain and help you sleep." Clara drank the medicine obediently, grimacing at the taste. As the doctor stepped away again, she looked back at Kieran. "Will you stay, just until I fall asleep?" The request surprised him, but he nodded. "Of course." Her eyes held his gratefully before slowly drifting closed. Kieran watched as her breathing evened out, the lines of pain in her face softening slightly. Only when he was certain she was asleep did he turn to Dr. Sullivan. She mentioned men looking for debt payment from her brother. Heard anything about loan sharks or gamblers causing trouble around here? Sullivan frowned, lowering his voice. "There's been talk of a man named Vance Holloway running high-stakes games down near Blackwater Creek. Rumor has it he doesn't take kindly to those who can't pay up." The name matched what Clara had told him. "You know where I might find this Holloway?" "I'm a doctor, not a gossip," Sullivan replied, though his tone had softened. "But if I were looking, I'd start at the Silver Spur in Blackwater, and Quinn," he added as Kieran turned to go. "Be careful. Holloway doesn't operate alone, and I've treated more than one man who crossed him." Kieran nodded, glancing back at Clara's sleeping form. "What about Miss Kincaid? She can't stay here alone. My wife will help tend to her. We have a spare room upstairs where she can recover once she's stable enough to move." "I'll be back tomorrow to check on her," Kieran said, placing his hat back on his head. "And I'll cover her medical expenses." Sullivan raised an eyebrow. "That's generous for someone you just met." Kieran didn't have an answer for that, at least not one he fully understood himself. Instead, he simply nodded and headed for the door, his mind already turning to the task ahead. The ride to Blackwater Creek would take the better part of a day, which meant he needed to return to his ranch first to make arrangements for his absence. As he mounted his horse, Kieran knew he was getting involved in something potentially dangerous, but the image of Clara Kincaid, burned and vulnerable yet still concerned for her brother, stayed with him. Whatever trouble she and her brother were in, Kieran couldn't simply turn his back. Not when he had the skills to help, and not when something about her called to him in a way no woman had in a very long time. Dawn painted the sky in hues of pink and gold as Kieran prepared for his journey. He had spent a fitful night at his ranch, his thoughts repeatedly drifting to the injured woman in Doc Sullivan's care. After arranging for his neighbor, old Frank Miller, to keep an eye on his cattle, he packed provisions and ammunition. The weight of his rifle in its saddle scabbard was a familiar comfort as he mounted up. The trail to Blackwater Creek followed the river for much of its length, winding through stands of pine and aspen. It was beautiful country, but isolated the perfect territory for men operating outside the law. Kieran kept a vigilant eye on his surroundings, hand never far from his revolver. By midday, he had covered significant ground. Pausing to rest his horse near a creek, he considered what little he knew about Vance Holloway. The name had surfaced a few times during his ranger days, always in connection with gambling and occasionally with violence, though nothing solid enough for arrest. If Holloway had escalated to burning homesteads and kidnapping, either he had grown bolder or more desperate. As Kieran continued his journey, the terrain grew rougher, the trail narrowing as it wound through rocky foothills. It was in a particularly narrow pass that his instincts flared. Slowing his horse, he scanned the ridgeline above. The shot came a moment later, the bullet kicking up dirt just ahead of his mount. Kieran reacted instantly, sliding from the saddle and drawing his revolver in one fluid motion. His horse, thankfully steady under fire, remained where he left it as Kieran took cover behind a large boulder. "That was a warning," called a voice from above. "Next one won't miss. I'm not looking for trouble," Kieran called back, eyes searching for the shooter's position. "Just passing through to Blackwater. Nobody just passes through to Blackwater these days, came the reply. State your business. Kieran weighed his options. If these men were connected to Holloway, revealing his purpose could be dangerous. But if they were simply territorial locals, honesty might be his best approach. Name's Kieran Quinn, looking for information on a man named Vance Holloway. A pause followed, then the sound of loose rocks rolling down the slope. Moments later, two men appeared on the trail ahead, rifles trained on Kieran's position. Neither looked particularly friendly. Why you looking for Vance? Asked the taller of the two, a lanky man with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow. Kieran slowly raised his hands, keeping his revolver visible but pointed downward. His men burned a homestead yesterday, took a young man named Timothy Kincaid. I aim to find out why. The two men exchanged glances. You law? Asked the second man, shorter but stockier with a bushy black beard. Not anymore, just a concerned citizen. The scarred man snorted. Concerned citizens tend to die young around these parts. I'm willing to take that risk, Kieran replied evenly. The Kincaids lost their pa this winter. They don't need more trouble. Something in his words seemed to register with the bearded man. Kincaid, you say? Andrew Kincaid's boy, Kieran nodded cautiously. You knew him. Knew Andrew. Decent man. The bearded man lowered his rifle slightly. Don't know nothing about his boy getting took, but if Vance is involved, you'll find him at the Silver Spur in town. Just don't expect a warm welcome. I appreciate the information, Kieran said, slowly lowering his hands. Any chance I could continue on my way now? The scarred man's rifle remained trained on him. Depends. You carrying anything worth taking? Just this revolver, my rifle, and enough supplies to get me to Blackwater and back, Kieran answered truthfully. Nothing worth dying over. The two men seemed to consider this, then the bearded man nodded. Let him pass, Silas. Man's either brave or stupid, but either way Vance will probably finish him off before sundown tomorrow. Silas lowered his rifle reluctantly. Your funeral, mister. Kieran holstered his revolver and returned to his horse, keeping his movements deliberate and his eyes on the two men. Much obliged, he said as he mounted up. Don't thank us yet, the bearded man called after him as Kieran rode past. Vance has eyes all over Blackwater. By the time you reach town, he'll know you're coming. The warning followed Kieran as he continued along the trail. If these men were right, the element of surprise was already lost. He would need to adjust his approach accordingly. Blackwater Creek came into view as the sun began its westward descent, a collection of wooden buildings straddling the creek that gave the settlement its name. It had grown since Kieran last visited, with several new establishments lining the main street. The Silver Spur was easy to spot, its freshly painted sign and lanterns already lit, despite the early hour setting it apart from the more weathered buildings surrounding it. Rather than riding directly into town, Kieran took a less obvious approach, leaving his horse at a small livery on the outskirts and proceeding on foot. The weight of his revolver was reassuring against his hip as he made his way toward the main street, hat pulled low over his eyes. The Silver Spur was doing brisk business, the sounds of piano music, laughter, and clinking glasses spilling into the street. Kieran paused outside, mentally preparing himself before pushing through the batwing doors into the smoky interior. The saloon was larger than it appeared from outside, with a long bar along one wall and several gaming tables scattered throughout. A quick scan revealed no one matching Timothy Kincaid's description based on what Clara had told him: a young man of 22 with sandy hair and a scar on his chin from a childhood accident. Kieran made his way to the bar, ordering a whiskey and nursing it slowly as he observed the room. The real action, he noted, seemed to be happening in a back corner where a poker game was underway. 4 men sat around the table, with a 5th standing watch nearby, a burly man with a revolver prominently displayed. New in town? Asked the barkeeper, a middle-aged man with a waxed mustache. Just passing through, Kieran replied. Looking for a man named Holloway, heard he might be around. The barkeeper's expression remained neutral, but his eyes flicked briefly toward the poker table. Lot of men pass through Blackwater. Can't say I know everyone. Fair enough, Kieran said, sliding a coin across the bar. Another whiskey, and maybe you could point me toward someone who might know more. The barkeeper pocketed the coin and poured another drink. If a man's looking for Holloway, it usually means he owes money or is looking to lose some. Which are you? Neither, just have a business proposition. In that case, the barkeeper said, leaning closer, you might try the gentleman in the black vest at the poker table, but I'd wait until the game's finished. He doesn't like interruptions. Kieran nodded his thanks, turning to observe the poker game more carefully. The man in the black vest was perhaps 40, with carefully groomed side whiskers and a gold watch chain visible across his waistcoat. His hands moved with practiced precision as he dealt cards, and his expression revealed nothing as he surveyed his own hand. This had to be Vance Holloway. The question now was how to approach him without ending up in a gunfight or worse, drawing attention before learning Timothy's whereabouts. Kieran was considering his options when the saloon doors swung open, admitting 2 more men. The taller one he recognized immediately as Silas, the scarred man from the trail. The second man, stockier and with a swagger that suggested authority, surveyed the room before his gaze landed on Kieran. Well, well, the stocky man announced loudly. Boys, look what we got here. A ranger come to visit. Conversations faltered as heads turned toward Kieran. At the poker table, Holloway looked up, his expression hardening. Former ranger, Kieran corrected, maintaining a calm demeanor despite the tension suddenly filling the room. And I'm not here on official business. That right, the stocky man approached, stopping a few feet from Kieran. Because word is you're asking about Vance Holloway and some business that ain't yours to stick your nose in. At the poker table, Holloway laid down his cards and stood. That's enough, Maddox, he called. Let's hear what the man has to say before we decide if he's a problem. Maddox looked disappointed but stepped aside as Holloway approached. Up close, Holloway had cold eyes that assessed Kieran with calculating precision. I understand you're looking for me, Holloway said. Unusual for a ranger, former or otherwise, to come calling without backup. I'm here about Timothy Kincaid, Kieran stated plainly, seeing no benefit in pretense. Your men burned his homestead and took him yesterday. His sister nearly died in that fire. Something flickered across Holloway's face, surprise, perhaps, though it was quickly masked. Kincaid's debt is a private matter between him and me. The fire, if there was one, is regrettable but has nothing to do with our business arrangement. Burning a woman out of her home goes beyond business, Kieran countered. Where is he? Holloway's expression hardened. You seem very concerned about the Kincaids for a man with no official standing. What's your interest in this matter? Let's just say I don't like bullies, Kieran replied evenly. Kincaid's sister is under a doctor's care with burns over a good portion of her body. She's worried about her brother. Touching, Holloway said dryly. But Timothy Kincaid borrowed money from me, quite a substantial sum, and has yet to repay it. Until he does, he's working off his debt. How much does he owe? Holloway named a sum that made Kieran's jaw tighten. It would take months of labor to work off that amount, even if Timothy was being paid fairly, which Kieran doubted. I'm prepared to negotiate a settlement, Kieran said, aware of the eyes on them. A thin smile spread across Holloway's face. Are you now? And what do you have to offer that would interest me? A business proposition. One that would clear Kincaid's debt and potentially benefit you more in the long run. Holloway studied him for a long moment, then gestured toward a door at the rear of the saloon. Let's continue this conversation somewhere more private. As Kieran followed Holloway toward the back room, he caught Maddox's eye. The stocky man was watching him with open hostility, one hand resting near his holstered revolver. Whatever happened in that back room, Kieran knew he would need to proceed with extreme caution. The back room was sparsely furnished with a desk, several chairs, and a small safe in the corner. Holloway closed the door behind them and moved to the desk, pouring 2 glasses of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. Now, Holloway said, offering 1 glass to Kieran, explain to me why I should give up a perfectly good laborer who owes me money. Kieran accepted the glass but didn't drink. Because dead men can't pay debts, and if Kincaid's sister dies from her injuries, you'll have the territorial marshals on your doorstep faster than you can fold a bad hand. Holloway's expression darkened. Are you threatening me, Mr. Quinn? Just stating facts. Burns can go bad quickly. If infection sets in, she might not last the week. Kieran set his untouched drink on the desk. I'm offering to pay Timothy's debt half now, half when he's released unharmed. And where does a former ranger get that kind of money? I run cattle now, have a decent spread east of here. Holloway leaned back, considering this. Let's say I believe you. What's to stop me from taking your money and keeping Kincaid anyway, or simply having Maddox put a bullet in you once you've paid? Because contrary to what you might think, I didn't come unprepared, Kieran replied calmly. I've left instructions with trustworthy individuals. If I don't return, they'll ensure the territorial authorities learn exactly who's responsible for burning the Kincaid homestead and whatever happens to me. It was a bluff, but one delivered with enough confidence to give Holloway pause. The gambler studied him with new respect. You're either very brave or very foolish, Mr. Quinn. Holloway swirled the liquid in his glass. But you've piqued my interest. Kincaid's debt is $500. You bring me that amount in full and he walks free. You have until noon tomorrow. Kieran had expected this. $500 was more than he had on hand, but not impossible if he could access his bank in Copperhill. Where is he now? Safe, Holloway replied with a thin smile. And he'll remain that way as long as our arrangement proceeds smoothly. I want proof he's alive and unharmed before I hand over any money. Holloway considered this, then nodded. Fair enough. Return tomorrow with the money and you can see him before the transaction is completed. Kieran knew this was the best offer he was likely to get. I'll be here at noon. As he turned to leave, Holloway's voice stopped him. One more thing, Mr. Quinn. This matter with the fire, my men can be overzealous at times. If what you say about the Kincaid woman is true, that was not my intention. Kieran looked back, searching Holloway's face for sincerity and finding none. Tell that to Clara Kincaid when she wakes up screaming from the pain of her burns. Without waiting for a response, Kieran left the room, acutely aware of the eyes following him as he crossed the saloon floor. Outside, the evening air was a welcome relief from the smoky interior. He had accomplished his primary goal, confirming Timothy was alive and negotiating terms for his release, but now faced the challenge of raising $500 by noon tomorrow. As Kieran retrieved his horse and headed out of Blackwater, his thoughts returned to Clara. He hoped she was resting comfortably under Doc Sullivan's care, unaware of the dangerous game he was now playing. Something about her courage in the face of pain, her concern for her brother, even while suffering herself, had stirred feelings in Kieran he'd thought long buried. It would be a long ride back to Copperhill, but every mile would bring him closer to helping the woman who had unexpectedly come to occupy his thoughts. The moon hung full and bright in the night sky as Kieran rode into Copperhill, his horses' hooves echoing on the deserted main street. Despite the late hour, a lamp still burned in Doc Sullivan's front window. Dismounting stiffly after the long ride, Kieran tethered his horse and approached the door, knocking softly. Sullivan himself answered, looking weary but alert. "Quinn," he said with mild surprise. "Didn't expect you back so soon." "How is she?" Kieran asked without preamble. Sullivan's expression softened slightly. "Better than I expected, actually. The burns are serious, but she's young and strong. Fever broke a few hours ago, which is a good sign." Relief washed over Kieran. "Is she awake? Can I see her? She's sleeping now, and best not to disturb her." Sullivan stepped back, gesturing Kieran inside. "But you look like you could use a drink and a chair. Come in." Kieran followed the doctor into his office, accepting the offered whiskey gratefully. As he sank into a chair, the events of the day caught up with him, fatigue settling into his bones. "You found the brother?" Sullivan asked, pouring himself a modest drink. Kieran nodded, taking a sip of the whiskey. "Found who's holding him." "Vance Holloway wants $500 for his release." Sullivan whistled softly. "That's a hefty sum. The Kincaid place couldn't be worth much more than that, especially now." "I've offered to pay it," Kieran said, staring into his glass. "Need to visit the bank first thing tomorrow." The doctor studied him curiously. "You're going to considerable trouble for people you barely know." It was a question Kieran had been asking himself throughout the ride back. Why was he so invested in the Kincaid situation? Clara's face came unbidden to his mind, her determination even through pain, the trust in her eyes when she asked him to stay. Someone needs to, he finally answered. And I'm in a position to help. Sullivan seemed to accept this, though his expression suggested he suspected there was more to it. You're welcome to sleep in my spare room tonight. Mrs. Sullivan has already retired, but she left some stew warming on the stove if you're hungry. Kieran accepted gratefully, his stomach reminding him he hadn't eaten since midday. After a hearty bowl of stew and another small whiskey, Sullivan showed him to a modest but comfortable room upstairs, across the hall from where Clara was resting. Try not to wake her, Sullivan advised quietly, indicating the partially open door. She needs all the rest she can get. Kieran nodded, but once Sullivan had retreated downstairs, he found himself drawn to Clara's door. He told himself he just wanted to check on her to see with his own eyes that she was recovering, but deep down, he recognized a more complex motivation. Pausing at the threshold, he peered into the dimly lit room. Clara lay still on the bed, her breathing even in sleep. The bandages on her visible burns stood out starkly against her skin, a painful reminder of what she'd endured. Yet even in sleep, there was a serene beauty to her face that caught at something in Kieran's chest. He was about to withdraw when her eyes suddenly opened, finding his in the half-darkness. "Mr. Quinn," she whispered, her voice stronger than when he'd left her. "I'm sorry to disturb you, Miss Kincaid," he said softly, remaining in the doorway. "I just returned and wanted to make sure you were all right." Timothy. The hope and fear in that single word tugged at Kieran's heart. "He's alive," Kieran assured her, stepping into the room but keeping a respectful distance from the bed. Being held by a man named Vance Holloway over gambling debts but alive and supposedly unharmed, relief flooded her face. Thank God, then her expression shifted to concern. But Holloway. "I've heard rumors, he's dangerous. I've arranged to pay your brother's debt," Kieran said. "I'm to meet Holloway at noon tomorrow with the money." Clara struggled to sit up, wincing with the effort. "No, I can't let you do that. It's too dangerous and we could never repay you." Kieran moved to her side, gently helping her adjust her position against the pillows. "The decision's already made, Miss Kincaid, and as for repayment, we can discuss that after your brother's safe and you're recovered." She looked up at him, her hazel eyes searching his face in the lamplight. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know us." It was the same question Sullivan had asked, and Kieran still wasn't sure he had an answer he fully understood. "Let's just say I know what it's like to lose family and have no one step up to help," he finally replied. Clara's hand found his, her touch feather-light but warm. "I don't know how to thank you. You can thank me by focusing on getting better," he said, unexpectedly affected by the simple contact. "Those burns need time to heal." She nodded, though determination flashed in her eyes. "Once Timothy is safe and I can travel, we'll need to assess the damage to our homestead, if anything can be salvaged." "One step at a time," Kieran cautioned. "For now, you need rest." Clara's eyes were already growing heavy, the brief conversation taxing her limited strength. "Will you come back, after you meet with Holloway?" "I will," he promised, reluctantly withdrawing his hand from hers. "Now sleep, doctor's orders." She smiled faintly before her eyes closed. Kieran remained for a moment, watching as she drifted back to sleep, before quietly retreating to his own room. Morning came too quickly, sunlight streaming through the curtains as Kieran woke with a start. He dressed quickly, strapping on his gunbelt with practiced efficiency. Downstairs, he found Mrs. Sullivan, a plump, cheerful woman in her 40s, preparing breakfast. "Good morning, Mr. Quinn," she greeted him warmly. "James told me about your late arrival. You must be hungry after such a long day." Kieran accepted a plate of eggs and bacon gratefully. "How's Miss Kincaid this morning?" "Stubborn as a mule," Mrs. Sullivan replied with affectionate exasperation. "Wanted to get up and dress herself, if you can believe it. James had to practically order her to stay in bed." The image brought a smile to Kieran's face. Clara Kincaid clearly had a fighting spirit, something he couldn't help but admire. After breakfast, Kieran headed directly to Copperhill's small bank. As a respected rancher with good standing in the community, he had little trouble arranging to withdraw the necessary funds, though the bank manager's eyebrows rose at the amount. "Buying more cattle, Mr. Quinn?" the manager inquired as he counted out the bills. "Something like that," Kieran replied noncommittally. With the money secured in his saddlebags, Kieran made one more stop before leaving town: the sheriff's office. Sheriff Dawson was a capable lawman, but his jurisdiction technically ended well before Blackwater Creek. Still, Kieran wanted someone to know where he was going and why. The sheriff listened to Kieran's abbreviated account of the situation with growing concern. "Holloway's a slippery one," he commented when Kieran finished. "Been hearing rumors about his operation for months, but nothing solid enough to act on." "I'm not looking to cause trouble," Kieran assured him. "Just want to get Timothy Kincaid out safely." Dawson stroked his mustache thoughtfully. "If you're not back by sundown, I'll gather some men and come looking. But Quinn," he added seriously, "be careful. Holloway doesn't like loose ends, and a former ranger paying off someone else's debt might look mighty suspicious to him." "I appreciate the concern," Kieran said, rising to leave. "But I can handle myself." The ride to Blackwater Creek was tense, Kieran's senses alert for any sign of trouble. He arrived shortly before noon, the town as dusty and unwelcoming in daylight as it had been the previous evening. The Silver Spur was quieter now, with only a few patrons nursing drinks at the bar. Holloway was waiting in the same back room, this time accompanied by Maddox and another man Kieran didn't recognize. A single chair had been placed in the center of the room, occupied by a young man with sandy hair and a distinctive scar on his chin: Timothy Kincaid. The young man looked up as Kieran entered, confusion evident in his features. His face bore evidence of rough treatment: a bruised cheek and split lip, but he appeared otherwise unharmed. "Who are you?" Timothy asked, his voice hoarse. "Name's Kieran Quinn," Kieran replied, keeping his eyes on Holloway even as he addressed Timothy. "Your sister Clara sent me to bring you home." Timothy's eyes widened. "Clara, is she all right? These men, they—" "Enough," Holloway interrupted sharply. "Mr. Quinn isn't here for a family reunion, he's here to conduct business." The gambler turned to Kieran, extending his hand. "The money." Kieran reached into his coat, withdrawing the carefully counted bills. $500, as agreed. Holloway took the money, thumbing through it with practiced efficiency before nodding to Maddox. "It's all here." "Now release Kincaid," Kieran said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Holloway smiled thinly. "Of course, our business is concluded." He gestured to the man guarding the door. "Cut him loose." The guard moved forward, producing a knife to cut the ropes binding Timothy to the chair. As the young man stood, rubbing his wrists, Holloway addressed him directly. "Consider your debt paid in full, Mr. Kincaid, but I suggest you find your entertainment elsewhere in the future. Our establishment will no longer welcome your patronage." Timothy nodded wordlessly, clearly eager to leave. Kieran placed a steadying hand on the young man's shoulder, guiding him toward the door. "One moment, Mr. Quinn," Holloway called as they reached the threshold. "A word of advice. Next time you involve yourself in other people's debts, consider the cost more carefully." "Not everyone would be as understanding as I've been." The threat was thinly veiled, but Kieran merely nodded. "I'll keep that in mind." Outside, Timothy practically collapsed against the hitching post, his legs unsteady. "I don't understand," he said, looking up at Kieran with bewilderment. "Who are you? Why would you pay my debt?" "Like I said, your sister sent me," Kieran replied, helping the younger man toward where his horse was tethered. "We can talk more on the ride back to Copperhill, but we should put some distance between us and Blackwater first." Timothy's expression darkened at the mention of Copperhill. "Clara's in Copperhill? Why? What happened after they took me?" Kieran hesitated, unsure how much to reveal about Clara's condition. "There was a fire at your homestead. Clara was injured." "A fire?" Timothy's face paled. "How bad?" "Is she all right?" "She's recovering," Kieran assured him, helping him mount up behind the saddle. "Doc Sullivan is taking good care of her." As they rode away from Blackwater, Kieran could feel the young man's shock and guilt. It wasn't until they were well clear of the town that Timothy spoke again. "It's my fault," he said quietly. "All of it. Clara warned me about the gambling, but after Pa died." He trailed off, shaking his head. "How bad is she hurt? Tell me the truth," Kieran sighed. "She was burned pretty badly. Left side mainly, and her back. Doc says she'll recover if infection doesn't set in, but it'll take time." Timothy was silent for a long moment, absorbing this. "And our home, mostly destroyed from what I saw." Another long silence followed before Timothy asked the question Kieran had been expecting. "Why did you help us? What do you want in return?" "I don't want anything," Kieran replied honestly. "I found your sister when she needed help and I was in a position to provide it. Simple as that." It wasn't entirely simple, of course. Something about Clara Kincaid had affected Kieran in ways he couldn't fully articulate: her courage, her determination, her concern for her brother, even through her own pain. But that was more than he was prepared to discuss with Timothy, or even fully acknowledge to himself. As they continued toward Copperhill, Kieran found himself both anticipating and dreading Clara's reunion with her brother. She would be relieved to see Timothy safe, certainly. But what would come after? With their home destroyed and Timothy's gambling clearly a continuing problem, the Kincaids faced an uncertain future. And where did Kieran fit into that future, if at all? It was a question he wasn't ready to answer, even as he recognized the pull Clara had on his thoughts and, increasingly, his heart. The sun was low in the western sky by the time Kieran and Timothy rode into Copperhill. Doc Sullivan's house was their first stop, with Timothy practically leaping from the horse before it had fully stopped. "Easy," Kieran cautioned, dismounting more carefully. "Let me go in first. Clara's injuries are serious and she needs calm." Timothy nodded reluctantly, following Kieran to the door. Dr. Sullivan answered their knock, his expression brightening at the sight of Timothy. "You must be the brother," he said, offering his hand. "Your sister will be relieved to see you." "How is she?" Timothy asked anxiously. "Improving, though she needs rest and careful tending for some time yet." Sullivan glanced at Kieran. "I see your mission was successful." Kieran nodded. "No complications." Sullivan seemed to understand the significant things left unsaid. "Clara's awake. She's been asking for both of you since midday." Inside, Mrs. Sullivan greeted them warmly before leading the way upstairs. At Clara's door, she paused. "Try not to excite her too much. Her body's been through a tremendous ordeal." Timothy entered first, his steps faltering at the sight of his sister. Clara was sitting up against the pillows, her bandaged arm and shoulder visible beneath a loose nightgown. Despite her injuries, her face lit up at the sight of her brother, Timothy. She exclaimed, extending her uninjured arm toward him. Timothy moved to her side, carefully embracing her as tears streamed down his face. "Clara, I'm so sorry. This is all my fault." "SHH," she soothed, stroking his hair with her good hand. "You're safe now, that's what matters." Kieran hung back, watching the reunion with mixed emotions. There was satisfaction at seeing Clara's joy, but also an unexpected pang of something like longing. After a moment, he turned to leave, feeling like an intruder on the siblings' private moment. "Mr. Quinn," Clara called, stopping him at the threshold. "Please stay." He turned back, finding her eyes on him, bright with gratitude and something else he couldn't quite name. Timothy straightened, wiping his tears as he faced Kieran. "Mr. Quinn paid my debt," Timothy told his sister. $500. I don't know how we'll ever repay such a sum." Clara's gaze remained on Kieran. "We'll find a way," she said softly. "Though I suspect Mr. Quinn would tell us not to worry about that right now." Kieran nodded, slightly uncomfortable under her perceptive gaze. "Your recovery comes first. Everything else can wait." Mrs. Sullivan appeared in the doorway behind him. "I've prepared a room for Timothy and dinner will be ready shortly. Clara should rest now." Timothy nodded, reluctantly releasing his sister's hand. "I'll be back after dinner," he promised. Once Timothy had followed Mrs. Sullivan downstairs, Kieran found himself alone with Clara. She studied him with those remarkable hazel eyes, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "You're a man of your word, Mr. Quinn," she said. "Thank you for bringing my brother home." Kieran moved closer to her bedside, drawn by the warmth in her voice. "Holloway won't trouble you again, I made sure of that." Her smile faltered slightly. "At considerable cost to yourself. Timothy's right, $500 is a sum we can't easily repay." "I don't expect repayment," Kieran assured her. "Consider it a loan with no fixed term. You can repay it if and when you're able." Clara's eyes searched his face. "Why, you barely know us." It was the question she'd asked the night before, and Kieran still wasn't sure he had an answer that made sense, at least not one he was ready to voice. Instead, he said, "Sometimes helping is its own reward." She didn't look convinced, but let it pass. What happens now, our homestead, is damaged but not beyond repair, Kieran said, making a decision he hadn't fully formed until that moment. I have some men who can help rebuild once you're well enough to return. Hope flashed across her face. That's very generous, but no buts, he interrupted gently. Let me help, Clara. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the sound of it hung in the air between them. She looked momentarily surprised, then pleased. All right. Kieran, she replied, her voice softening on his name. Something shifted between them in that moment, a connection forming that transcended their brief acquaintance. Kieran found himself wanting to remain by her side, to learn everything about her, to see her smile and hear her laugh without pain shadowing her features. The spell was broken by Mrs. Sullivan's return, announcing dinner was served. Kieran excused himself, promising to return the following day. As he left the Sullivan home, his thoughts remained upstairs with the remarkable woman who had unexpectedly come to occupy such a significant place in his considerations. Over the next 2 weeks, Kieran divided his time between his ranch and Copperhill. Timothy had taken temporary work at the livery stable, determined to begin repaying the debt even as Kieran insisted it wasn't necessary. Clara's recovery progressed steadily, the burns healing well under Dr. Sullivan's care. Kieran found himself spending more time at Clara's bedside than was strictly necessary, bringing books to read aloud when she was tired, or simply talking with her about everything from cattle ranching to her childhood dreams. There was an ease to their conversations that surprised him, a sense of understanding that belied their short acquaintance. It was during one such visit, as spring sunshine streamed through the window, that Clara broached the subject of returning to the homestead. Dr. Sullivan says I can travel in another week if I continue to improve, she said, her fingers idly tracing the edge of a bandage on her arm. The worst of her burns were healing nicely, though the doctor warned she would always bear some scars. Kieran nodded, having already discussed this with Sullivan. I've sent some men ahead to assess the damage and begin clearing the debris. The main house will need extensive rebuilding, but the barn was largely spared. Clara's expression was determined. We can manage with the barn temporarily. What matters is getting back to our land. It won't be comfortable, Kieran cautioned. Comfort is a luxury we can't afford right now, she replied pragmatically. What matters is salvaging what we can of the growing season. Her resilience never failed to impress him. Despite everything she'd endured, Clara's focus remained on the future, on rebuilding rather than dwelling on what had been lost. I've been thinking, Kieran said, an idea that had been forming in his mind for days finally taking shape. Your land borders the eastern edge of my ranch. What if we combined our efforts this season? My men could help with your planting while the rebuilding continues. Clara looked surprised. That's very generous, but we couldn't impose further. It's not an imposition, he insisted. It makes practical sense, and… He hesitated, then continued more softly. I'd like to keep an eye on you during your recovery. A flush crept into her cheeks, but her eyes held his steadily. People will talk, you know, a bachelor spending so much time helping a single woman. Let them talk, Kieran replied, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. Unless you're concerned about your reputation, Clara's laugh was unexpectedly bright. My reputation? Mr. Quinn, I'm a scarred homesteader with a gambling-prone brother and no prospects. I dare say my reputation can withstand a little neighborly assistance. There was a self-deprecating humor in her words that concealed genuine vulnerability. Kieran found himself reaching for her hand, covering it with his own. You sell yourself short, Clara Kincaid, he said quietly. And I'd say your prospects are improving by the day. The flush in her cheeks deepened, but she didn't withdraw her hand. Are they indeed? The moment stretched between them, weighted with unspoken possibilities. It was Timothy's arrival that finally broke the spell, the young man entering with a stack of lumber samples from the mill. If Timothy noticed the hastily withdrawn hands or the lingering glances between his sister and Kieran, he gave no indication. Instead, he launched enthusiastically into descriptions of the rebuilding plans, his earlier despondency replaced by renewed purpose. As Kieran finally took his leave that evening, Clara called him back with a soft question. Will you be here when Dr. Sullivan removes the last of my bandages tomorrow? The vulnerability in her request touched something deep within him. Of course, he promised. I'll be here. True to his word, Kieran arrived at the Sullivan home the following afternoon. Dr. Sullivan greeted him with a knowing smile that Kieran chose to ignore, leading him upstairs to where Clara waited. She sat on the edge of the bed, dressed in a simple blue dress. Mrs. Sullivan had altered to accommodate her healing burns. Her hair, which had been singed in the fire, had been trimmed to just below her shoulders and gleamed like burnished copper in the afternoon light. "Ready?" Sullivan asked her gently. Clara nodded, her eyes finding Kieran's for reassurance. He moved to stand beside her, offering silent support as Sullivan carefully removed the bandages from her shoulder and upper arm. The newly healed skin was pink and delicate, with areas of scarring that would likely fade somewhat with time but never disappear completely. Clara looked down at her exposed arm, her expression unreadable. "The burns have healed remarkably well," Sullivan pronounced, examining the skin carefully. "You'll need to protect it from the sun for some time, and the skin may feel tight as it continues to heal, but you've avoided the worst complications." Clara nodded, still staring at her arm. "Thank you, doctor, for everything." Sullivan patted her good shoulder gently. "You did the hard work, young lady. I'll leave you two for a moment while I prepare some salve for you to take home." As the doctor left, a heavy silence filled the room. Kieran watched Clara, uncertain what to say as she continued to examine her scars. "Not very pretty, is it?" She finally said, her voice soft but steady. "Clara," Kieran began, kneeling before her so she would meet his eyes. "Those scars are a testament to your strength and courage. There's nothing about them or you that isn't beautiful to me." Her eyes widened slightly, searching his face for any sign of insincerity. Finding none, she reached out with her scarred hand, gently touching his cheek. "You really mean that, don't you?" Instead of answering with words, Kieran turned his face slightly, pressing a gentle kiss to her palm. The gesture was impulsive but felt entirely right, a physical expression of emotions he was only beginning to fully understand. Clara's breath caught, but she didn't withdraw her hand. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving his. Kieran rose slightly, closing the distance between them until their lips met in a gentle, questioning kiss. It lasted only a moment, but when they parted, something fundamental had changed between them. Kieran knew with sudden clarity that Clara Kincaid had become essential to him, in ways he hadn't believed possible again after the losses of his past. "I should probably warn you," he said softly, still close enough to feel her breath against his lips, "that I'm beginning to have serious intentions toward you, Clara Kincaid." A smile bloomed across her face, transforming it with a radiance that took his breath away. "In that case, I should probably warn you that those intentions are likely to be reciprocated, Kieran Quinn." Their second kiss was interrupted by the sound of Sullivan clearing his throat in the doorway, an amused expression on his face as he held out a jar of salve. "I see my patient is recovering her spirits as well as her strength." Clara blushed beautifully, but there was no shame in her expression as she accepted the salve. "Thank you, doctor, for everything. You're welcome to stay another week if you wish," Sullivan offered. "Mrs. Sullivan has grown quite fond of you." Clara shook her head. "It's time to go home, or what's left of it," she amended with a touch of pragmatism. "Tomorrow then," Sullivan agreed, "provided you rest well tonight." As Kieran left the Sullivan home that evening, his steps were lighter than they had been in years. The path ahead would not be easy. The Kincaid homestead needed extensive rebuilding, and Clara's recovery would continue for months. But for the first time since finding her amid the ashes of her home, Kieran felt true hope for the future, not just for Clara and Timothy, but for himself as well. The journey to the Kincaid homestead the following day was slow, with frequent stops to allow Clara to rest. Kieran had brought his most reliable wagon, outfitted with extra blankets to cushion the ride. Timothy rode alongside on a horse borrowed from the livery, his expression alternating between anxiety for his sister and determination to make amends for his part in their current situation. As they approached the burned-out homestead, Clara's hand found Kieran's on the wagon seat. The sight that greeted them was both better and worse than she had imagined. The main house was indeed a charred shell, but Kieran's men had already cleared much of the debris and begun framing a new structure. The barn stood relatively intact, its door propped open to air out the lingering smell of smoke. "It's going to be all right," Kieran said softly, squeezing her hand. "We'll rebuild it better than before," Clara nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I know, it's just seeing it like this." "I understand," he replied, and she knew he truly did. During their conversations over the past weeks, he had shared the story of losing his own family home to raiders when he was a boy, a loss that had ultimately led him to join the Rangers years later. Timothy had already dismounted, surveying the work with growing optimism. "The foundation's solid," he called. "And look, they've salvaged some of the furniture from the back rooms." Clara smiled at her brother's enthusiasm, grateful for his renewed spirit. The gambling that had led them into trouble had been a response to grief. She knew a way to escape the responsibility that had fallen on his young shoulders after their father's death. Now, with a clear purpose before him, Timothy seemed more like his old self. Kieran helped Clara down from the wagon, his hands steady at her waist. "The barn's been prepared for you to stay in temporarily," he explained. "It's not ideal, but it's clean and dry." "It's perfect," she assured him, leaning into his strength for a moment. "Thank you, Kieran, for everything." The weeks that followed established a new rhythm to their lives. Kieran divided his time between his ranch and the Kincaid homestead, overseeing the rebuilding while also ensuring his own cattle were tended. Timothy worked tirelessly alongside the construction crew, learning carpentry skills he had never needed before. Clara, though still recovering her full strength, insisted on contributing. She managed the household affairs from a chair placed in the shade of the barn, mending what clothing had been salvaged and preparing meals for the workers. Her burns continued to heal, though she remained careful to keep the sensitive skin covered from the sun. As spring gave way to early summer, the new Kincaid house took shape, larger and sturdier than the original. Kieran had insisted on certain improvements, including a deep well closer to the house and a stone hearth that would be safer than the previous one. It was during a rare moment alone, as they sat on the newly constructed porch watching the sunset, that Clara finally broached the subject they had been circling for weeks. "Timothy says we should be able to move into the house within a fortnight," she said, her hand resting comfortably in Kieran's. "The bedroom floors are finished, and the roof is nearly complete." Kieran nodded, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "He's become quite skilled with a hammer. Frank Miller mentioned he might hire him for some work on his place once this is finished." Clara smiled, pleased by her brother's growing reputation. "He's found his purpose again. I'm grateful for that." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "But that leads me to something I've been meaning to discuss with you." Kieran turned to face her, his expression open but slightly wary. "What is it?" "The debt," she said simply. $500 is no small sum, and while we're grateful for your patience, Clara," he interrupted gently. "I've told you not to worry about that. But I do worry about it," she insisted. "It's a matter of pride, Kieran. We need to repay what we owe." He was silent for a moment, studying her determined expression. "All right," he finally said. "I have a proposition for you." "A way to settle the debt that might benefit us all." Clara raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." Kieran shifted slightly, suddenly looking uncharacteristically nervous. "Your land and mine share a border. Together, they would make a formidable ranch more efficient, more productive than either alone." Her heart began to beat faster as she realized what he might be suggesting. "Are you proposing a business arrangement, Mr. Quinn?" "Not exactly," he replied, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Though that would be part of it." Taking a deep breath, Kieran slid from the porch bench to one knee before her, still holding her hand in his. "Clara Kincaid, these past weeks have shown me what I was missing in my life without even knowing it. Your courage, your determination, your kind heart, they've become as essential to me as breathing." Clara's free hand flew to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes as he continued. "I'm not asking you to repay any debt. I'm asking you to do me the honor of becoming my wife. To join our lives and our lands, to build something greater together than either of us could alone." For a moment, she couldn't speak, overwhelmed by emotion. When she finally found her voice, it was steady and sure. Yes, oh Kieran, yes. He rose just enough to capture her lips with his, a kiss that sealed their promise and spoke of all the hopes they shared for their future. When they finally parted, both breathing a little faster, Kieran reached into his pocket. "I have something for you," he said, producing a small silver ring with a modest pearl set in the center. "It was my mother's. She would have wanted you to have it." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Clara was struck by how far they had come since that terrible day when Kieran had found her amid the ashes of her home. From desperation to hope, from pain to healing, from strangers to lovers, their journey had been unexpected but felt somehow destined. "It's beautiful," she whispered, admiring the way the pearl caught the last light of sunset. "Not half as beautiful as you," Kieran replied, joining her again on the bench and pulling her gently against his side. They sat together in comfortable silence as darkness fell, planning their future in quiet exchanges. The house would be finished in time for a late summer wedding. Timothy would have his own room in the new house, but was welcome to move to Kieran's ranch with them if he wished. Their combined lands would give them one of the more substantial ranches in the territory. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Clara leaned her head against Kieran's shoulder, a deep contentment settling over her. The fire that had nearly claimed her life had instead brought her to this moment, to this man, to this future full of promise. "What are you thinking?" Kieran asked softly, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "That sometimes the worst days of our lives can lead us to the best," she replied, turning her face up to his. "And that I'm very glad you were the one who found me that day." His arms tightened around her, protective and loving. "So am I, Clara, so am I." The wedding of Kieran Quinn and Clara Kincaid took place on a perfect late summer day, with the newly completed Kincaid house as its backdrop. The entire community of Copperhill turned out for the celebration, curious to witness the union that had been the subject of so much speculation over the past months. Clara wore a simple ivory dress that Mrs. Sullivan had helped her select, with long sleeves to cover the worst of her burned scars, not out of shame, but practicality against the sun. Kieran thought she had never looked more beautiful, her copper hair arranged with wildflowers, her eyes bright with happiness as she walked toward him on Timothy's arm. "Doctor." And Mrs. Sullivan stood as witnesses, the doctor beaming with pride at Clara's recovery. Sheriff Dawson attended as well, along with most of Kieran's ranch hands and the men who had helped rebuild the Kincaid homestead. Even old Frank Miller made the journey, bringing a fine heifer as a wedding gift. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, with Clara and Kieran exchanging vows beneath an arch of aspen branches. As they sealed their union with a kiss, cheers erupted from the assembled guests, celebrating not just a marriage but the triumph of hope over hardship. The festivities continued well into the evening, with dancing and feasting under lantern light. As dusk fell, Kieran found a moment to draw his new wife away from the celebration, leading her to a quiet spot where they could see both the Kincaid homestead and, in the distance, his own ranch house where they would make their home together. "Happy, Mrs. Quinn?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist as she leaned back against him. "Impossibly so," she replied, turning in his embrace to face him. "If someone had told me 4 months ago that I would be standing here as your wife, I would have thought them mad." "Life has a way of surprising us," Kieran agreed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Though I must admit, from the moment I found you, something in me knew you were special." Clara's eyes softened at the memory. "You held me until help came. I remember feeling safe for the first time since the fire started, even through the pain." "I'll always keep you safe," he promised, drawing her closer. "And Timothy too, though he's becoming quite capable of looking after himself." She smiled at the mention of her brother, who had thrown himself wholeheartedly into learning ranching from Kieran. "He admires you greatly, you know. Said just yesterday that he couldn't have wished for a better brother-in-law." "High praise," Kieran chuckled. "He's a good young man. Just needed direction." They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, contemplating the future that stretched before them. The combined Quinn-Kincaid ranch would be one of the largest in the county, with prospects for growth that neither could have achieved alone. "We should return to our guests," Clara finally said, though she made no move to leave his embrace. Kieran nodded but tightened his arms around her. "In a moment. I just want to remember this you here as my wife with our whole life ahead of us." She reached up to touch his face, her scarred hand gentle against his cheek. "Our whole life," she echoed. "I like the sound of that." When they finally rejoined the celebration, it was with a renewed sense of joy and anticipation for the future they would build together. As friends and neighbors offered congratulations and good wishes, Kieran kept Clara close at his side, still marveling at how fate had brought them together in the most unexpected way. Later that night, as they prepared to leave for their new home together, Dr. Sullivan pulled Kieran aside for a moment. "I've been meaning to tell you something," the doctor said, his expression unusually serious. "The day you brought Clara in, her burns were severe enough that many wouldn't have survived them." Kieran nodded, remembering all too clearly the fear he had felt that day. "What saved her, apart from her own remarkable constitution, was the immediate care you provided," Sullivan continued. "Holding her, keeping her calm, getting her to medical attention quickly, those actions made all the difference." "I only did what needed doing," Kieran replied, uncomfortable with the praise. Sullivan smiled knowingly. "And therein lies the measure of a man. Take good care of her, Kieran." "She's as remarkable as you are." "That she is," Kieran agreed, his eyes finding Clara across the yard where she was saying her goodbyes to Mrs. Sullivan. "That she certainly is." As they rode together toward their future, toward the home they would share, and the life they would build, Kieran reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From the moment he had found Clara burned and barely conscious amid the ruins of her home, to this night as her husband, it had been a path neither of them could have foreseen. Yet somehow, it felt right, as if all the hardships each had endured had been leading them to this moment, to each other. And as Clara's hand found his in the darkness, Kieran knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, stronger for having found each other in the ashes of what was lost. 5 years later, the sound of children's laughter floated through the open windows of the Quinn ranch house, bringing a smile to Clara's face as she finished arranging wildflowers in a vase. Outside, Kieran was teaching their 3-year-old son, Andrew, to ride his first pony, while 5-year-old Catherine supervised with all the authority a big sister could muster. "Not too fast, Papa." Catherine called, her dark hair so like her father's escaping from its braids as she danced around the corral. "He's fine, kitty cat," Kieran assured her, his hand steady on the pony's bridle as little Andrew bounced excitedly in the small saddle. Clara moved to the doorway, one hand resting unconsciously on her rounded belly where their third child grew. The scars on her arm and shoulder had faded to silvery marks over the years, occasionally tight during weather changes but no longer painful. She had long since stopped trying to hide them, accepting them as part of her story, part of what had led her to this life she cherished. The Quinn-Kincaid ranch had flourished beyond their expectations. The combined lands now supported one of the finest herds in the territory, and their reputation for fair dealing had made Kieran a respected figure throughout Montana. Timothy, now 27, managed the original Kincaid homestead, which they had developed into a successful horse breeding operation. He had recently begun courting the new schoolteacher in Copperhill, a development that brought Clara immense satisfaction. As Clara watched her family, a wave of gratitude washed over her. The fire that had nearly claimed her life had instead led her to greater happiness than she could have imagined. Every day with Kieran and their children was a gift, one she never took for granted. "Mama." Catherine spotted her in the doorway and came running, her face alight with excitement. "Andrew is riding all by himself." "Well, almost," she amended with the honesty of childhood. Clara laughed, hugging her daughter close. "I can see that, sweetheart. He's very brave, just like his big sister." Kieran looked up, his eyes finding Clara's across the yard. Even after 5 years of marriage, that look still sent a flutter through her heart, the warmth, the love, the promise in his gaze. With a few instructions to Andrew about holding the reins, Kieran secured the pony to the fence post and made his way to his wife and daughter. "How are you feeling?" he asked, one hand gently touching Clara's rounded belly while the other smoothed Catherine's wayward hair. "Wonderful," she replied truthfully. "Though your son or daughter seems to be practicing for the rodeo today." Kieran's face lit up as he felt the baby move beneath his palm. "Strong like their mama," he said softly, before dropping a kiss on her forehead. "Papa." Andrew called from his perch on the pony. "Look at me." "I see you, Cowboy," Kieran called back. "You're a natural," pride shone in his eyes as he watched his son, and Clara was struck again by what a wonderful father he had become. The man who had once ridden alone as a ranger had found his true calling in this life they had built together. "Timothy's coming for dinner," Clara reminded him, leaning comfortably against his side. "And he's bringing Miss Ellison." Kieran's eyebrow rose in amusement. "That's the third dinner this month. I'd say things are getting serious." "So would I," Clara agreed with a smile. "She's good for him, steady." The sound of hoofbeats announced a rider approaching, and they turned to see Timothy himself coming up the drive. At 27, he had grown into a confident young man, the recklessness of his youth tempered by responsibility and hard-earned wisdom. "Uncle Timothy," Catherine shouted, breaking away from her parents to race toward her uncle's horse. Timothy dismounted in time to catch his niece as she launched herself at him. "There's my kitty," he laughed, swinging her in a circle before setting her down. "And is that a real cowboy I see on that pony?" Andrew waved excitedly from his mount. "It's me, Uncle Tim. I'm riding." "So you are," Timothy agreed, approaching to ruffle the boy's hair. "A fine horseman in the making." As Timothy joined them at the house, Kieran clapped his brother-in-law on the shoulder. "You're early. Miss Ellison not joining us after all." "She'll be along shortly," Timothy replied, a slight flush rising in his cheeks. "I wanted to speak with you both first." Clara exchanged a knowing glance with Kieran. "Children, why don't you go help Aunt Martha in the kitchen? I believe she was planning to make apple tarts for dessert." At the mention of tarts, both children scampered toward the house, leaving the adults alone in the yard. "I'm going to ask Sarah to marry me," Timothy announced without preamble once the children were out of earshot. "I wanted your blessing first." Clara's eyes filled with happy tears as she embraced her brother. "Of course you have our blessing. Sarah is wonderful, and it's clear how much you love each other." "Have you spoken to her father?" Kieran asked, practical as always. Timothy nodded. "Last week. He gave his permission, provided I could offer her a secure future." He hesitated, then continued. "That's the other thing I wanted to discuss. I've been saving to build a proper house at the homestead, something worthy of a wife and, God-willing, children." "The horse breeding has been profitable," Kieran acknowledged. "You've done well with it." "Thanks to your guidance," Timothy replied. "But I was hoping. That is, I wanted to ask if you'd consider a more formal partnership arrangement, make the Quinn Kincaid brand official across both properties." Clara looked at her husband, curious to see his response. They had discussed such an arrangement in the past, but had been waiting for Timothy to suggest it himself. Kieran's face broke into a grin. "I was wondering when you'd bring that up." "I've already had the papers drawn up there in my desk whenever you're ready to review them." Timothy's expression was one of surprise, then gratitude. "Really? You've been thinking about it too?" "For some time," Kieran confirmed. "You've more than proven yourself, Timothy. It makes good business sense, and more importantly, it keeps family together." The two men shook hands, an agreement sealed with the mutual respect that had grown between them over the years. Clara watched them with a full heart, thinking of how far they had all come from that terrible day when fire had threatened to take everything from her. As the day faded into evening, their home filled with the people they loved. Sarah Ellison arrived, blushing prettily when Timothy greeted her with obvious adoration. Doctor and Mrs. Sullivan joined them for dinner, the doctor now semi-retired but still full of stories and good humor. Even Sheriff Dawson made an appearance for after-dinner coffee, bringing news of the territory's continued growth. Seated at the head of the table with Clara at his side, Kieran surveyed the gathering with quiet satisfaction. This was what he had built from the ashes of that burned homestead, not just a successful ranch, but a family, a community, a legacy of love and resilience. As if sensing his thoughts, Clara's hand found his beneath the table, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture as familiar and essential as breathing. When he turned to meet her gaze, the love he saw there still took his breath away, just as it had on that first day when he had found her burned and barely conscious and held her until help came. "Thank you," she whispered, too softly for anyone else to hear. "For what?" he asked, equally quiet. "For finding me, for saving me, for loving me." Kieran brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her scarred knuckles, a reminder of what they had overcome together. "Best thing I ever did," he murmured against her skin. "Best thing I ever did." And as they turned back to their guests, their children, their family, both blood and chosen, Clara knew it was true. From the darkest day of her life had come her greatest blessings. The fire that had nearly destroyed everything had instead forged something unbreakable, a love strong enough to rise from the ashes and build a future brighter than either of them could have imagined alone.